Hey everyone, so I want to talk to you today about one of the kind of myths that we hear quite a lot and maybe we're thinking about for ourselves, and something that you hear a lot and it's not really true. So one of the common phrases that you hear all the time is something about the hip flexors, and the phrase we often talk about or hear is the phrase of saying, get out the hip flexors. So you may have tight hip flexors, you may have back pain, you may feel that your hip flexors are always taking over, and in Pilates you often hear instructors saying, relax the hip flexors, and don't use the hip flexors, use your abs instead. And we're on this kind of permanent quest all the time to stretch and release our hip flexors in a kind of way to feel more open through the hips, and therefore feel more open in the lower back. So the hip flexors, the psoas is a major one of the hip flexors, and it has a really important job to do. And when you're beginning and starting out in Pilates, it is really, really difficult to get out of your hip flexors. What do we mean by that? So let's take the roll up, for example. You often see in the roll up, you might recognize this yourself, as you roll up the upper body, the legs lift. We don't want to lift the legs, and they keep lifting, and that means that instead of going forward, we keep going back down to the floor. And we often hear that feeling of, my hip flexors are too tight, you need to release your hip flexors to be able to roll up. And that's just kind of not really the case. When your upper body lifts up off the floor, yes, you do get the rectus abdominis muscles, that's the major work to lifting the torso upwards. If the feet keep lifting, instead of the rectus doing this job to pull ourselves up, if that's not strong enough, then what happens is the thigh bones get pushed backwards towards the body, and it's that sort of tilting action that lifts the feet off the ground. What can we do about it? So what we can't do is just simply say, don't use your hip flexors. That's just stupid. You have to use your hip flexors every time you're using your legs. When you're lifting your legs up in the air in this kind of bent tabletop position we often use a lot, the hip flexors are under this shortened tension. So let's imagine a most typical kind of person. They're sitting at their desk perhaps a lot, going home and then sitting on the sofa. Your hip flexors are in a kind of shortened state. So we feel sometimes that our hip flexors are too tight, and therefore are too short and are too strong, and that's what's causing us to have a problem, an imbalance, and maybe that's pulling on our back. But often or not, our short hip flexors are not strong at all. They're actually really, really weak because we're not really doing much with them. They're just in this hypertonic state of being shortened because I'm sitting in this same sort of right angle shape in a seat or in my sofa or in my chair. And therefore the muscles aren't really getting used. They're just hypertonically short and stuck in this kind of position. So we actually need to strengthen the hip flexors, the muscles, and strengthen our abdominals and strengthen our back muscles, so that they all play a part to make the whole chain work together, not to rely on one thing being more dominant than the other. So it's very hard to say to somebody, don't use this, don't use that. That's not what we want to talk about. But it's very hard for somebody to release their hip flexors and don't use them when they've started out in Pilates, and that's all they know. That's all they've got. What we do need to do is get somebody into their abdominals and create a very important factor that we talk about in Pilates of the scoop and the lift. Now, a lot of training in Pilates, they talk about pulling your navel towards your spine. So just do this with me. Pull your belly button slightly in towards your spine. You might feel a bit of tension going across your centre, your torso. Now pull it all the way in towards your spine, right, all the way to the back. Yes, when I did mine, you can see I kind of bend forward. So how do you know when you're pulling the muscles kind of in that way, what's going on? As you're pulling them in, I might be pulling them all the way back in and actually causing my whole back to round and my lower back to shorten. So what we're looking for to get out of our hip flexors, i.e. to get into our abdominals, is a feeling of drawing in and up. And the in is what recruits a kind of stiffening and hardening of the torso, and that gives us strength to our centre of our body. But the up, that's the magic. That's the beauty shot. And I'm going to give you a little prop here. I've got a spring. This is one of the little springs from the pedipalp. It's quite a strong little spring. This spring, you can see, made up of lots of coils. At the minute, that spring is closed, and you can hardly really see through the coils. So imagine that's your spine, and you're not creating any lift in your spine. This is the spine that you've got this way, and your coils are your vertebrae, and in between those coils, if you can pull and see apart, that would be where your nerves are running through, and that nervous system feeds other parts of the body. It feeds other muscles, but also feeds other organs. So if our spring and our coils are quite closed, and we're just working in this kind of position, which quite frankly most of us are, then the coils are closed and short, the spring is quite short, our spine is quite short, the nerves that feed through it have got some limitation, and if you imagine that each coil of the spring is maybe one of your vertebrae, where they're all stacked nicely on top of each other, they're pressing down on each other. Now we've got the force of gravity going against us as well, pushing even more so down here. Now this is a nice strong spring, so it would be like a healthy spine, but imagine, like that, something was to buckle. That, in a very rudimentary kind of crude way, is the force of gravity pressing on us, and that buckling is where our discs tend to bulge and slip. Now have a think about what this would happen if our spring and our coils were open. How about if our spine looked a bit more like that? Well, that's what Pilates teaches you. So in classical Pilates we talk about the in and the up. The up, as I said, is the magic part, and that's what's getting us into our abdominals. And as we lift, the scooping, lifting feeling is what's getting us out of our hip flexors into our back muscles and creating space between our vertebrae. So Shari Berkowitz, one of the teachers that I've done some workshops with, she referenced it to thinking of the cans of tuna fish stacking up on top of each other. I don't know why that's always really stuck in my mind. A can of tuna fish stack, stack, stack. Try and imagine that in between each can that they've got like a hovering space, and then another one, another one. Think of it as this spring. Pull the coils apart. Look how much space is in between those coils. Imagine that's your vertebrae. How much space would you have for your nervous system to work through there? So, you know, maybe we have back pain, but maybe we have a weakness or an overactivity or an issue with our pelvic floor. Maybe we've got other issues through the rest of the body, into our buttocks, into our arms. You remember, this spring is our spine. That's not just our lower back, it's our mid back, it's our upper back, and there's a bobby little head here. So if any of these vertebrae here are slightly shortened and pressed down on and not elongated, then how is the flow of energy going to move through the body nicely? How is it going to affect our other organs, and how our other muscles work? It's going to have quite a big impact. So Pilates magic of the lifting up is what makes the spring open. So I always say to people in the class, imagine that you have a spring inside your body, and as you pull into your centre and you access the spring, try to pull the spring up. And you're pulling it up from the lower back, up through the middle back, up from the head. Oh, I've gone, my eyebrows have gone, look how much lift I've got. Of course, over the course of the day, gravity starts to press it all back down. And if we're not defying that gravity with that beautiful lift all the time, then it does start to take a toll on our back. So in our back care workshop, if anybody's interested, we are running a back care workshop on the 20th of February at 7 o'clock. And in that back care workshop, we'll be looking at techniques using the fascia balls. The fascia is like a spider's web that connects your whole body. And we're looking at how we could release some of the tension that is caused in the fascia that might be pulling parts of the body shorter together, and therefore causing us to have some back pain and back tension. We're going to be looking at that lift and that magic. And we're going to be looking at some muscle strengthening techniques that we use in Pilates to strengthen the muscles that may be weak and imbalanced around it because of this kind of issue that we have in posture. So 20th of February, if you can come, we'd love to see you there. Bye.